Sivaraman S. He completed his undergraduate studies from Tyagarajar College of Engineering. He pursued architecture with almost 5 years of practice and allied 3 years of professional architectural photography. He worked as an architect for Studio Kriya Architects Private Limited, which is a part of TVH Housing, Chennai. And he also worked for the Architectural Design Group, ADG, headed by A.R. Dhanasekaran, Chennai. He's also worked for many other organizations like Design Cube Architects, Carbon Design Consultants, and AIM Associates previously.
Welcome to UGC lecture series in B Architecture. This is Vernacular Architecture AR 6001, Unit 1, Lecture 1. I'll give you a brief summary of the contents. We'll be looking at a few images to get you to understand the vernacular architecture language in order to be able to understand the field and move the study further. Then we look at words, which are the derivations and definitions which shaped the word vernacular architecture. Then we talk about the specific relation between vernacular architecture and an architect. Then we'd elaborate further to go to a broad study which won't be elaborate but specific to a certain set of examples. And then we'd further move on to the influences of vernacular architecture and its typologies. So, as I said, first we'll be seeing a few images. This is an image of Rondewell from South Africa. The next is a Maasai house from Tanzania. This is a house from Timbuktu and Payahut, Italy. This is a black house from Scotland. So, we had a quick look at 5 images from around the world. Now, I take you closer to a few examples at home. Closer home, this will be the Dungas or the boat houses from Kashmir, the Havelis of Gujarat, Agraharams in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, and the mansions of Chettinad. Now, we had a quick look at all these images. So, I want you to consider these images and following definitions and derivations. So, in order to understand any field, any study or any specific character of any study, you need to look at the words, its epistemology and derivations. So, when you look at vernacular architecture, let's look at how the word was derived. So, vernaculus meaning domestic, native and indigenous. Verna meaning native slave or homeborn slave. I guess you could overlook the word slave and look at something to the effect of homemade or of homeborn needs. In the field study of linguistics or languages, a vernacular language refers to a language used particular to a time, place or a group. So, those were some of the derivations. So, looking at definitions and their derivations helps us to get closer to understanding any study. Now, we look at some direct definitions of vernacular architecture. I'd start off with a very critical definition by one of renowned architects, F. L. Wright. So, he defines vernacular architecture as folk building growing in response to actual needs, fitted into environment by people who knew no better than to fit them with native feeling. So, this is a rather critical way of defining vernacular architecture. Nevertheless, as a definition, we will look into what makes F. L. Wright say that. The next definition is by a certain person called Ronald Brunskill, who is an English academic, who has done extensive study in British vernacular architecture. So, he defines vernacular architecture as a building designed by an amateur without any training in design. Okay? So, please note that. The individual will have been guided by a series of conventions built up in his locality, paying little attention to what may be fashionable. So, I would also like you to take a keynote of the word fashionable. The function of the building would be the dominant factor, aesthetic consideration though present to some small degree being quite minimal. The next thing he says is local materials would be used as a matter of course, other materials being chosen and imported quite exceptionally. So, if you look at these keywords without any training in design, little attention to what may be fashionable, the function of the building, local materials. These are some keywords which will be played throughout vernacular architecture and they in fact define what vernacular architecture is. So, we looked at two different critical definitions, and that is for you to understand vernacular architecture a bit more critically. I would also like to mention what vernacular architecture is not. So, it is important to understand what something is not, so as to get closer to understand what it is. So, vernacular architecture is not something that is designed by architects. This can be quite ambiguous, but nevertheless it is more accurate, because architects usually put a lot of time into design, have a premeditated notion, but vernacular architecture is not so. So, as I said, architecture designed by architects is usually not termed as vernacular architecture, though which is being followed a lot and which is considered a good practice would be to choose to incorporate those features in our present practice. The very process of conscious design makes it not vernacular. So, putting conscious design into something, into a building, makes it somewhat not vernacular. We will see why. Also, vernacular architecture is not necessarily specific to olden days or modern times. So, when someone says vernacular architecture, it does not have to necessarily mean that it is something from the past or our history books. It can be something today. You walk into a rural setting today, they will be building something on their own for their own needs. So, that can be termed vernacular, but not necessarily ancient. So, this is what vernacular architecture is not. So, I did tell you about F. L. Wright talking about vernacular architecture a bit critically. Even though he said that, I would offer some food for thought, which says, by F. L. Wright himself in this case. F. L. Wright suggests that vernacular architecture is a primitive form of design lacking intelligent thought, but still is a better word study than all the highly self-conscious academic attempts at the beautiful works throughout Europe. So, while vernacular architecture may not be intelligent, may not be fashionable, may not be very intended in terms of aesthetic appeal, it does have a lot of things for us to shed light on in terms of the evolution of architecture, the needs of the people, and how vernacular architecture has evolved from time to time. To the effect that he says it is better worth study than going to any beautiful works throughout Europe. So, those were critical definitions and an understanding of what vernacular architecture is essentially not. But when someone asks you what vernacular architecture is or define vernacular architecture, these would be some terms and some definitions which you could use. Vernacular architecture is a term used to categorize methods of construction which use locally available resources and tradition to address local needs. Vernacular architecture tends to evolve over time to reflect the environmental, cultural and historical context in which it exists. Another definition, it is an indigenous architecture with specific time or place, which not necessarily is imported or copied from elsewhere. It is most often applied in residential buildings. So, when you study vernacular architecture from the past, you will notice it applies a lot to residential buildings and dwellings. In contrast to planned architecture by architects, again as I said in contrast, the building knowledge in vernacular architecture is often transported by local traditions and is thus more, but not only, based on knowledge achieved by trial and error. So, you notice this highlighted part about knowledge achieved by trial and error. So, vernacular architecture resides basically on the foundation that everything has been tried out, found, researched about its errors, and then taken further and evolved into its final shape. So, this is a generation of trial and errors, which makes it starkly contrasting to architecture, which is most systematic and based on geometry rather, but not only based on knowledge achieved by trial and error and often handed down through generations rather than calculated on knowledge of geometry and physics. So, the architecture today is dependent on a lot of aesthetics which is governed by geometry, physics, fashion. This though is passed on from a local set of traditions which are again, as I said, experimented on a trial and error basis. So, now we have got through a few images of understanding visually what vernacular architecture is, putting words to effect of what the derivations and definitions are brought to explain what vernacular architecture is. Some books you can ponder over is Architecture Without Architects. So, the term itself suggests that vernacular architecture and architects are a bit distant cousins. So, Architecture Without Architects by Bernard Rudofsky, Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture of the World by Paul Oliver. These are two important books which not necessarily explains the vernacular architecture throughout the world, but helps you to give an understanding of system and structure, which you can apply to the study of vernacular architecture. So, the next topic we will be going through, as I said, is the obvious relationship between vernacular and the architect. I would like you to consider these two images. The one on the left is in Britain, British architecture, British colonial architecture properly. The image on the right is also in Britain, England of course, but it is vernacular architecture. So, if you look at them both, you will understand visually what I mean. It does not have to be explained. This is more based on geometry, technicalities, a lot goes into the aesthetic appeal. This is more in terms of what a person needs in the moment on a very local and temporary basis. So, this is the contrast between architecture and vernacular architecture. I have taken you through how an architect defines vernacular architecture in the words of F.L. Wright. Now, as I said, Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture is a good way to start. Paul Oliver is an important person who contributed to the study of vernacular architecture. So, in his words, it is contended that popular architecture designed by professional architects or commercial builders for popular use does not come within the compass of the vernacular. So, that is pretty obvious. Popular architecture, or generally architecture of today, is not considered vernacular architecture, and it does not come within the compass of the vernacular. It can be contrasted against polite architecture, which is characterized by stylistic elements. So, you notice the word stylistic elements of design intentionally incorporated for aesthetic purposes, which go beyond a building's functional requirements. This is the most primary point. When you talk about vernacular architecture, a person identifies his needs, puts some methods and principles to address his needs with the local available materials and gets his work done. But in terms of architecture, which is termed polite architecture here, you incorporate stylish elements which may or may not be functional. Yes, they do serve functional purposes, but they also appeal a lot to the aesthetic needs of present day people. So, this is maybe a bit shocking, but it is very true. Only 1 in 10 of the buildings in which we live are designed by architects. So, contrary to the very precipice of us architects practicing architecture, here is the truth of how buildings are not always designed by architects. 1 in 10 buildings in which we live are designed by architects, and a huge part of the world's architecture is vernacular. The rest of the architecture may or may not fall under vernacular, but it certainly is not architecture. So, the rest of the world, as you see, everyone does not employ architecture. What they do is they address their own needs and they come up with their buildings which address their needs. So, many modern architects have studied vernacular buildings and claim to draw inspiration from them, including aspects of the vernacular in their design. So, as I said, as even F.L. Wright has mentioned, that even though it has not been an intelligent or intellectual piece of work in terms of buildings, it is nevertheless a study which is which can be used to study the ongoing evolution, the reasons for which a building gets shaped, and various other factors like climate, available materials, the social aspects, the cultural aspects, and also the economic aspects. While it may not be termed vernacular, studying the approach and concepts of vernacular architecture helps them better understand the culture, context and climate, precisely as I said. So, here I have some examples of how architects have looked to vernacular architecture as an inspiration, as a way to study and incorporate in their buildings. Hassan Fathy, his works primarily in Egypt. What he did, Hassan Fathy is an architect in the times of Le Corbusier and F.L. Wright. So, he is an inspiration when you have to look at people who study vernacular architecture and try to retain its features. So, Hassan Fathy studied traditional Nubian settlements from Egypt and technologies. He incorporated the traditional mud brick walls of the Nubian settlements in his building. An important work of Hassan Fathy would be the housing he did for thieves and robbers. You can have a look at it, and most of his work, when you look at it itself, shows that it has been a product of study from the past. So, unfortunately, the first traditional Nubian settlements that he studied and the technologies he applied failed, but nevertheless it has been a start for such studies. So, the experiment failed due to a variety of social and economic reasons. As I said, vernacular architecture is not specifically restricted to the local needs or available materials. It puts into precipice the socio and economic reasons and the culture. So, in terms of that, this experiment failed, but nevertheless led to a lot of other things. As I said, it is the first recorded attempt by an architect to address the social and environmental requirements of building users by adopting methods and forms of the vernacular. So, continuing further, another person who did a lot in terms of study, but not just restricted himself to vernacular architecture, played modernism into it, is Geoffrey Bawa, the architect from Sri Lanka. Originally from England, living in Sri Lanka, he brought about the style which is prevalent a lot in South Asia right now, which is called regional modernism. He also derived a lot from vernacular architecture. Charles Correa and B.V. Doshi, home in India, are two pioneers of the vernacular architecture of the local architecture, adaptations of the local architecture. I don't need to tell you a lot about them because their works are plenty to see. Srila Sri Prakash, an architect who has used rural Indian architecture as an inspiration for innovations in environmental and socially economical sustainable design. So, on one side, vernacular architecture is a good study for us to look into architecture and its needs better. On the other side, to look into future also, vernacular architecture is a very much an inspiration, because vernacular architecture in its very foundation of addressing local needs and keeping in terms to the climate and the culture makes it in itself a bit of a sustainable concept. So, that is an example which can be an inspiration to future settlements. So, here the image on the left is by Srila Sri Prakash. The one between is Geoffrey Bawa's work. This is Charles Correa's, and down, as I said, the works of Hassan Fati, where he studies the vernacular architecture and he brings them into some housing experiments that he's done. Next, we move on to a simple study. So, we had an understanding of vernacular architecture, what vernacular and architect have in common, and such things. So, now I just apply a direct study, so you can distance yourself from a little bit from the definitions and talk about some direct examples. So, here is the example of a Moroccan desert fortresses. You look at the image, you understand it's nothing to do with present day architecture or architecture that involves a lot of design. I'll read out some features for you which has shaped what it looks like and rather defines vernacular architecture more or less. So, it's a fortified village commonly called as kasbahs. So, when you, in case you want to read more about these desert fortresses, they are called kasbahs with small windows built high and close to each other. So, you notice that every design feature has a reason in which they have been put to. This is a direct response to the climate and utilitarian aspects. So, when you design, when these people design for themselves, they don't consider fashion, they don't consider aspects like premeditated notions to be considered for design. So, it is also a method of expression of wealth and prosperity. As much as we talked about the utilitarian aspects, culture and socio-economic reasons also form an expression in terms of buildings for vernacular architecture. It was also a defense strategy. So, and kasbahs are a skillful adaptation to the harsh climate and hot arid regions. So, apart from being what they need, are a direct response to the climate dictations of that particular region. So, the layout of the kasbahs, height, orientation, the use of materials play a major role in the temperature regulation. So, it is a direct result of the climate. Another example is the norias of Hamas. So, we were talking about a desert fortress which directly deals with dwellings and residential buildings. This is an example of vernacular which does not have to restrict itself to just living buildings or immediate needs. So, this is norias of Hamas is nothing but a huge wheel which was used to elevate water from one level to another level. So, this is simply a direct need answered, and since it did not have much of design or premeditated notions, it forms an important example of the vernacular architecture. So, an example of how vernacular was not just architecture but also extended to other aspects such as mechanical and social purposes. Norias are water wheels to raise water from one level to another. It was run by animal power, a response to harness water utility which can be termed an ingenious method. So, as I said, indigenous, ingenious, local, these are words that are going to be played around vernacular architecture a lot. It is a significant example of how the vernacular is a process. So, vernacular architecture does not, as I said, specify only architecture. It talks about how the vernacular is a process of how a settlement evolves in terms of socio-economic reasons, in terms of culture, in terms of architecture, in also terms of planning and the city or the settlement development. Okay, so we are going to be talking about the influences that affect vernacular architecture. So, I want you to consider these two images as well. So, if you look at these images, you can get a rough idea of what influences vernacular architecture. The first thing that strikes me or should strike you obviously is the materials used. When you look at a modern building, the materials are rather brutalist or rather evident of what they are in themselves, but these show that these are locally confined materials that are easily available and can be put to use pretty easily. And the next thing that you can notice is it's rather temporary or not premeditated for a long time or not intended to stand for a very long time. They just answer their need, which shows that they adapt themselves to a lot of reasons. So it helps you to understand that there are a lot of reasons which go into the making and evolution of vernacular architecture. The next thing that you can see is its response to climate. You have a sloped roof, which means that it is a response to the precipitation of the area. There is something called as the wind tunnel. So, they are reacting to the wind that is there. The openings are not typically big or with shutters as such. So, that also means that these are small and meant for perforations for the wind. So, these are all direct responses to the climate. Next image you can see is more relevant to the Indian context. If you notice, you talk about you look at courtyards, there are gables, water bodies and the plinth. So, these are direct responses. You raise the plinth so that you can capture the wind. There is a water body which shows that it is a reaction to the climate. So, in order to cool the relevant temperature of the zone, there is a water body. They have placed a courtyard which acts as a way to funnel the hot air up and bring in more cold air. And then there are gables which act as lights that bring in and also a way to release the hot air. So, this gives you a rough idea of what influences architecture. We will be talking about them in detail. So, factors influencing vernacular architecture are climate and geological reasons, local materials use, technology adopted. So, the reasons or the various factors affecting vernacular architecture would be different in different typologies, but we can have a broad category and broad look at each of them. Vernacular architecture is influenced by a great range of different aspects of human behavior. So, apart from all these, human behavior or the human intent is an important part of shaping vernacular architecture, leading to different building forms for almost every different context. You can notice a difference between vernacular architecture between one village to the next village. So, that is how much vernacular architecture is complexly governed by. Yeah, as I said, even neighboring villages may have subtly different approaches to the construction and use of their dwellings with significant similarities in structural forms. The way of life of building occupants, so the key words here, occupants, and the usage of shelters greatly influence building forms. So, you talk about occupants, human intent and human need. The size of family units, spatial usage, preparation of food, interaction of people and many other cultural considerations affect the layout and the size of dwellings. You must be wondering what cultural effects can it have on a building in particular. I give you two examples. In Indian context, women are supposed to mingle with each other on various occasions of the day. So, they have a space for themselves. On the other side, men and children who act as teachers and students have another set of places. So, when you consider just these two reasons, this itself forms a lot of influential factors, and so there are numerous other reasons like this to shape vernacular architecture. Culture also has a great influence on the appearance of vernacular buildings, as occupants often decorate buildings in accordance with local customs and beliefs. People have different forms of shelters appropriate to different season and geographical locations. So, you can't make a prototype product. So, it's rather an evolution. People use summer spaces and winter spaces in a particular building. So, they make it adaptable to different climates and different cultural occasions. The development of different solutions in similar circumstances because of cultural influences is typical of vernacular architecture. So, a typical influence on vernacular architecture is culture and its effects. So, as I said, it is considered a study of worth. Vernacular architecture and its associated aspects of socio, economic, cultural and artistic features has been a source of study that has thrown light on approach to our living environment by people before us. So, in order to be a good architect, in order to understand architecture better, it would be a study which is worth which you could take up, because it directs you in terms of socio-economic, cultural and artistic features as well. So, vernacular architecture not only interests architects or archaeologists who can study from them, it also includes and interests people from other fields. In the field of sociology, intensive surveys of individual communities that discovered the buildings of different people. So, when you talk about different people and their buildings, you also throw light into the different individual communities. So, likewise they also interest geographers, students of folk life, architectural historians. Some types of vernacular architecture are domestic, agricultural, industry and religious. So, it started with domestic, but always it can't be restricted to that. It moves on to agricultural, industrial and religious. We talk about in detail of vernacular types in the coming presentation. Domestic vernacular architecture, agricultural, industrial, religious and so. So, the outcomes from this presentation would be understanding the derivations and definitions. It is also important to understand what vernacular architecture is and what it isn't. The relationship between an architect and vernacular and how they go and how they don't go together in many cases. The factors affecting vernacular architecture, a basic classification of the types of vernacular architecture. Some exercises that I would suggest to you in order to understand is to revisit your rural study. We all know that we do a rural study in our previous semesters. So, if you look at those things and apply the study of vernacular architecture to them, you will be able to understand that they are very much vernacular and you will be able to get a better understanding of the subject. A simple case study of one's ancestral history. So, you look at your own history of what your previous ancestors have done, their vernacular architecture, and also to research a list of vernacular architecture methods. So, you can pick out a list of methods from the vernacular architecture which you can incorporate in your building or in your designs. With this, we come to the end of lecture 1. Thank you.